Got the great pleasure now to introduce John Brockman. John Brockman is a cultural impresario whose trajectory has encompassed the avant-garde world, the world of science, of books, of software, and also the internet. In the 1960s, he invented the term intermedia and pioneered a lot of work in film, art, theater, and commerce. He also collaborated with Jonas Mekas, who is going to participate in the marathon later this afternoon. He was also consulting for clients such as General Electric, Columbia Pictures, Pentagon, and also the White House. In 1973, John formed Brockman Inc., a literary and software agency which specializes in serious nonfiction and works actually with extraordinary leading thinkers such as Richard Dawkins, Jared Diamond, Brian Greene, Daniel Kahneman, Steven Pinker, Martin Rees, and many others. John is also the founder of the Edge Foundation, and his website, edge.org, is our all great inspiration working on the marathon again and again. Last year, John held a session at the Map Marathon together with Louis Wolpert and also Armand Leroy, where they had a fascinating conversation about maps and science. During the Experiment Marathon in 2007, John did an edge session called What is Your Formula, Your Equation, Your Algorithm. This year, for the Garden Marathon, John will be in conversation with Brian Eno, with Jennifer Jacquet, and Mark Pagel. John will introduce them, we'll introduce their speeches, and then we will have a conversation. A very warm welcome to John, to Brian, to Jennifer, and to Mark.
Thank you, Hans Ulrich. Hans Ulrich and I are here today together because of my hat. In 1969, I met my next-door neighbor, James Lee Byers, the artist who became my friend and collaborator and has been unfortunately or fortunately, the inspiration to Hans Ulrich. And Byers and I spent 2 years walking in Central Park, starting and finishing each other's sentences. One of which, the best one, was, he wears his hat to deny his head. So Byers is dead, so fuck it. Today, we're here with a very disparate group of what we might call edgies. We have a composer, a fisheries scientist who studies shame and cooperation, and one of the leading evolutionary biologists. We will start with biology with Mark Pagel, who is professor of biology at Reading. He's the head of the evolution lab at the university, and the author of the Oxford Encyclopedia of Evolution and the forthcoming Penguin UK trade book, Wired for Culture. Each speaker has a maximum 15 minutes, maybe less. Then we'll have a panel. The whole thing will be about an hour. Mark Pagel.
Good morning, everyone. I'm just waiting for my slides to come up. Very good. Good morning again. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to talk to you about cities as gardens, continuing our theme of the Garden Marathon. And what I want you to realize is that human beings have been on this planet for 200,000 years. And up until 10,000 years ago, the world looked something like this. This is one vision of Arcadia. There weren't any roads, there weren't any permanent settlements. Population density was very low because all human beings were hunter-gatherers. But then about 10,000 years ago, something happened. Human beings discovered agriculture. And once they discovered agriculture, a small number of people could produce the food for everyone, enough food for everyone. And that freed others from the toil of hunting and gathering. And what did we do instantly upon inventing agriculture? We began our migration to cities. And so 10,000 years ago, right after the evolution of agriculture, we see this city in Turkey, Catalhayek, springing up. And already, by 10,000 years ago, maybe 3, 4, 5, 6,000 people lived in it. Around the same time, another city sprang up, Jericho in Israel. And that impulse somehow to move into cities has carried on, slowly at first, but increasing over time, so that by around 1800, 3% of humanity lived in urban areas or in cities. But by 2005, we'd passed a milestone in our history, and that 50% of humanity, 50% of all human beings lived in cities by 2005. And the projection is that by 2050, 3 out of every 4 of us will live in cities around the world. And so images like this will become the norm rather than the visions of Arcadia. And already we can make a plot of cities around the world of more than 1 million inhabitants. And that figure's only going to get larger and larger. And already the world at night reflects this movement to urbanization. And visions like this of Calcutta are commonplace. Swarms of people living in these urban areas. Very, very different from our vision of Arcadia and our vision of our original garden. Images like this are also becoming more and more common, these vast high-rise towers. But so are images like this, or images like this. And so we really want to understand why this impulse arose. Why is it that we went from this sort of vision of Arcadia, one vision of Arcadia, to this? Now, one answer we can give to this is a metaphorical one, a figurative one. And we might say that cities somehow allow us to mingle our obvious love of nature with the sort of human-built environment. This love of nature that must be hardwired into our DNA with the human-built environment. Somehow there's a joy we get out of that. And sure enough, cities are figurative gardens, aren't they? If we look around the world, we don't have to look very far to see the garden intruding on our cities in some sense. Beautiful gardens within cities. And of course, right here in Hyde Park, one of the most lovely gardens we can imagine within a city. And yet, this lovely metaphorical, almost poetic description of why we've moved to cities somehow falls way short of the mark, because we know that as soon as human beings started moving into cities, just 10,000 years ago, they suffered from 2 brand new forms of predation. The first form of predation they suffered from was from people who wanted to sack and plunder the cities they built. So if we go into the archaeological record, we see that as soon as humans started making cities, they started building defensive walls around them. And we could say that one of the greatest stories in all of Western literature, Homer's Iliad, is really the story of a city with a very thick defensive wall, one that took 10 years for the Greeks to breach. So the second form of predation, though, wasn't predation from without, but predation from within, because as soon as we moved into cities, we suffered from the plagues and pestilences of diseases that could fester among those high-density populations. Remember that by 10,000 years ago, we already had 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 people living in these little villages like Catalhayek. And so we somehow have to overcome all of the disadvantages of living in cities, these forms of predation. And there was also thievery within, wasn't there? And so it's not enough to merely give a figurative description. But it turns out we have an answer in the cities, because cities are much more than figurative gardens. It turns out that throughout our history, cities are actually literal gardens of human prosperity. They are the crucible of human civilization. And the reason is that cities have acted as these gardens for innovation and prosperity is really down to three things that we can document. And those of you living in London, this won't come as completely a surprise. One is that it's easy to show that cities have been historically magnets for creative people, innovative people, entrepreneurial people, wealth creators. They've been a magnet for that throughout our history. Social scientists and complexity theorists who study how cities grow are able to document that as cities increase in size, various things about cities go up faster than the rate of population growth, things that are good. And so it's known that as cities increase in size, the number of innovations increases faster than population growth. The number of new patents increases faster than population growth. Wages go up faster than population growth. Standard of living rises faster than population growth, all because cities have always attracted the creative, entrepreneurial, innovative types, have been magnets for that. And it's even the case that cities are more efficient than groups of people living in the countryside, so that cities in some sense are being touted as the new green centers of humanity. And here's why. As these good things increase faster than the rate of population growth, things that we might think of as bad about cities increase slower than the rate of population growth. So a city the size of London has fewer roads per capita than a city the size of Manchester, or the city the size of Oxford, or a city the size of Reading. It has fewer sewers per capita. It uses less heat per capita. It has fewer cables per capita. And so good things increase faster than the rate of population in big cities, and bad things increase at a slower rate. Cities are more efficient. So even though a huge city like London belches out enormous amounts of pollution, if you broke up London into a whole lot of smaller villages or towns with equal population, it would contribute far more pollution. And so, in some sense, cities are the green centers of humanity. But there's a catch. It all sounds too good to be true. It is. There is a catch. And that is, cities have to continually reinvent themselves to avoid this sort of thing, social and physical collapse. They have to reset their carrying capacity to be able to accommodate the increasing density of people. But for the reasons I've given you, they've been very, very good at that. And so we can realize that over time, what have cities done? Well, they've invented clean water. They've invented sewer systems. They've cleaned up their air. They've invented telephones. They've invented roads. All of these things make it easier for large numbers of people to live in these small environments. And we can see this going on and on. We've invented the internet, and who knows what will come next. And so for the very reasons that cities have been magnets for creative and innovative people, they've been able to reset their carrying capacity over time and largely avoid this sort of social and physical collapse. And so here's just a few pictures of the sort of things cities are good at. These are all biased toward transport, I'm afraid, but I've mentioned to you the other things like clean water and clean air and sewers and roads and so on, telephone exchange. Good at inventing subway systems, and of course we're all very affectionate about Boris's bike scheme. And so as we look to the future, we realize that somehow we're going to have to accommodate what looks like a lot more people on this planet. Here are three population projections to the end of this century. And the middle one is the one that, the golden one, is the one that most people accept now. And even it suggests that the 6 billion people we have on this planet now are going to rise to maybe 9 billion people by 2050. And so, using this idea of the city as a garden, we realize that to save our planet, the cities are going to be the true gardens of the 21st century to accommodate all these people. And so we're going to have to cultivate places like this if we want to be able to survive our growth into the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. There's been a lot of interesting work physicists, biologists getting together, Jeffrey West, talking about urban growth, and I will get to that in the panel. Next up, Jennifer Jacquet is a postdoctoral researcher at the Fisheries Center, Department of Mathematics, University of British Columbia. Her interests are environmental sustainability, particularly fish, evolution and function of guilt, honor and shame, the role of information technology in shaping environmental action. She's the author of a chapter in a book entitled Future Science, edited by Max Brockman, which is going to be a book forthcoming from Penguin Press. Jennifer Jacquet.
So I'm interested in how we make 6 billion people get along. And one way that we can do that is through shame, which is a really traditional way of getting people to adhere to social norms. So in the beginning, in the Garden of Eden, there was no shame, right? And it didn't take long before shame really took over, and gardens and shame became quickly intertwined. That the notion that they sort of traveled together. And Adam and Eve, who were naked and felt exposed, had to cover themselves. And in fact, you don't feel shame unless you believe someone else is watching what you're doing. So maybe shame is the reason that we need a God. So the idea of nakedness, which you can't really see in this, but the idea of being naked is central to the notion of shame, the idea of being exposed. And so this is almost certainly the reason why Alexander Baranov, who was the chief manager for the Russian-American company, was carved naked into the top of this totem pole, which you can see better on these smaller screens. And this was a pole raised in Sitka, Alaska in 1940. And the town had decided to honor a number of entities for their historical peace treaty. But the Native Americans, as part of their plan, historians believe, carved Baranov naked as a way of shaming him in this totem pole. And shame poles were actually one of many types of totem poles, which were very important to the gardens of Native communities along the Northwest coast. And in fact, we know this technology began in the 1700s sometime. This is the first drawing that we have on record of a totem pole done by John Bartlett, a fur trader from Boston in 1791. And the origins of these poles, pretty interesting. They started inside as interior poles, interior totem poles, and then they moved outside into the gardens. And if you go through archival records and you see, we sort of have this notion that totem poles are a tourist event, but they were everywhere. They covered the landscape of Native communities, really from the 17th to the 19th centuries along the Northwest coast. Almost every community, every Native culture had them except for the Salish nation. And again, the shame pole was one of these type of poles. And to me, it's the most interesting because they created these poles to make the shame sort of indelible, right? The whole community would realize that somebody had done something wrong and they would refuse to cooperate, or they would suffer sort of the reputational consequences of that action. So here's a really famous Tlingit Nation shame pole. It's called the Three Frogs pole. The three frogs represent 3 women from the Kiksadi Nation, the Kiksadi tribe. And their totem is a frog. And these 3 women were living with Chief Sakes. And they weren't paying their dues, essentially. No one was paying for them to stay with the other clan. And so they raised this pole to try to convince the Kiksadi clan to kick in some money. So sometimes the shame poles are also referred to as debtor totems or ridicule poles. And so here, again, these are hard to see, but here's a classic debtor totem at the top. Basically, if you see a white man in a totem pole, you can guarantee it's a shame, a shaming element. with a few exceptions, like these really beautiful, magnificent, if you get a chance, just Google them, the Lincoln totem pole. Abraham Lincoln was carved into a series of poles, and it's not clear whether or not really that was honor or shame. There's a lot of debate over the end of slavery, whether or not the Native communities viewed it as a positive or negative element. So I became interested in the shame pole because I study shame and am interested in it more broadly. And I was wondering, could we utilize this in a way that's effective today? And one carver, Mike Weber, in 2007, he actually erected a small shame pole for the Exxon Valdez oil spill and the lack of payment, again, the lack of the debt that Exxon owed his community. It was raised in 2007, and it's carved here. I'll go into it a little bit more later. But I thought, well, I have a lot of groups that I think deserve some shame, but I shouldn't really be the one making this decision. Shame ultimately adheres to a social norm. It's dynamic for that reason. It's fascinating. And I thought we could use the community to decide who should be shamed. So I took the 50 biggest corporations over the last 10 years, and here's the list, just in case you're interested in alphabetical order. And I posted these to this new system, Amazon Mechanical Turk. If you haven't used it, it's a way of accessing thousands of people online using this new Amazon system. People in the US, UK, India, and I actually only focused on Americans. I surveyed 500 Americans, and I asked them, which 10 of these 50 do you think have most negatively affected society? And this can be difficult because there are lots of things that subvert shame and reputation. And this was, for instance, the map that I submitted for this event last year for the Map Marathon. One thing that undermines shame in general, reputation in general, is the name changing. So when Philip Morris is bought out by Altria, that undermines any sort of reputation effects society could try to have on that corporation. So this was a map of names that have changed. But I collected the data. It looks sort of like data. And then I compiled it into which corporations were the worst by American standards, at least these 500 people. And this was the word map that came out. You'll see BP's on top, which, normally they say the top of the totem pole is a good thing, but not when it comes to shame poles. That I think we all know is from the oil spill. And then there are many others. So right now, I'm working with an artist, Oscar Beckler, who I hired in Seattle. He's a graduate of the Art Institute there, to digitally render and design a modern shame totem pole with these corporations in mind. So here is our first prototype taking a public spin. And it will be 3D, but we ideally will project it onto a large building. It will actually be animated. And I wanted to take you through some of the details, and it's sort of hard to see on this screen, but maybe the smaller ones will provide some clarity. But one of the things why the eagle is at the top, this is a bald eagle, white eagle, A, America. B, an animate object always has to be at the top of a totem pole. So BP, while it's the top and it's the crest of the breast of the eagle, it couldn't be the sort of head of the pole. There's always a living object at the top. And so there's a close-up of the eagle head if you can see it. The other thing is that in any sort of totem pole where there's a shaming element, there will be, one way you can tell that it is an indicator of shame is if the head is turned upside down. So here, right off the ground level, almost at eye level with the little boy, you can see a small head turned upside down. That's a ridicule element. And so even Mike Weber with this Exxon pole, this is the CEO of Exxon, Lee Raymond. His head is turned upside down, and he has a long nose because he said he wanted children to recognize that this man was a liar. And so we have the Walmart symbol turned upside down in our totem pole. The other thing is this is a shame totem of Chief Seward, a guy named Seward at Saxman in Alaska. And he had received a big feast and welcome from the Tlingit clan, and he didn't reciprocate. So again, this idea of debt, that you're not paying your share. And so they painted his ears and mouth and nose red to indicate stinginess. So we also, with Ronald McDonald, it wasn't hard. Obviously, his mouth and nose are already red. But we painted his ears red as well, as an indicator of the shame, the traditional shaming elements. You can also see Philip Morris is represented through the wings as the Marlboro packets. There are a lot of little details. Fox News, Rupert Murdoch's face is actually sort of cut off in the background. There will be headlines going through that TV. And unlike a regular totem pole where you would take a structure and then carve detail out of it, in our totem pole, you have to actually create objects and then shrink wrap them into a totem. So I'm hoping this video you can actually see, to just catch that. That's the technology in a software called Blender, working to shrink wrap this totem into the shape that you're seeing. And then at the bottom of the pole, there was the pig. You just saw that operating. The pig represents the bankers. AIG was the second biggest company that Americans voted had negatively affected society. There's Citibank, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America. They're all represented by those big ties that the pig is wearing on his breast. Fannie Mae is the house at the bottom. That's their corporate logo. Enron, Dow Chemical, and there are other elements, again, throughout the totem pole. So we look forward to exhibiting the pole in its entirety. About 100 feet is what we're hoping for sometime soon in New York or LA, hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Brian Eno is many things to many people. If I spend time with him in London, people line up asking him arcane questions about music I've never heard of. I hear he composes, sings, organizes a cappella choirs in Iceland, produces U2, Coldplay, has 88 albums to his credit, including most recently one I just bought, actually, Small Craft on a Milk Sea, Drums Between the Bells, and Everything That Happens Will Happen Today. That's 88 in how many years?
39.
But I know him as the consummate intellectual, somebody who can talk intelligently on a huge range of subjects. As a matter of fact, we recently put together the Best of Edge, series of 5 books. And the one on culture had a discussion we had in 1997 called A Big Theory of Culture, and it's been picked up in every review as the leading piece. And the book just got voted one of the 7 best interview books. And we need to do another interview together. Brian Eno.
And he didn't bring me a copy of the book yet either. It's not on sale in England yet. I haven't got my lavalier on. Is that okay? Can I just work on these mics? Thanks. About the time when I first started making records, I was also starting to become aware of a new sort of organizing principle in music. I think, like many people, I had assumed that music was produced or created in the way that you imagine symphony composers make music, which is by having a complete idea in their head in every detail and then somehow writing out ways by which other people could reproduce that. In the same way as one imagines an architect working, designing a building in all its details and then having that constructed. In the mid-60s, there started to appear some music that really wasn't like that at all. And in fact, it was about the time I started making music, and I found that I was making music in this same rather unusual new way. So the music I was listening to then, in particular in relation to this point, was Terry Riley's In C and Steve Reich's famous tape pieces, It's Gonna Rain and Come Out. Now, and various other pieces as well. Of course, I was also familiar with Cage and his use of randomness and new ways of making musical decisions, or not making them. What fascinated me about these kinds of music was that they really completely moved away from that old idea of how a composer worked. It was quite clear with these pieces, for example, in C, that the composer didn't have a picture of the finished piece in his head when he started. What the composer had was a kind of menu, a packet of seeds, you might say. And those musical seeds, once planted, turned into the piece. And they turned into a different version of that piece every time. So for me, this was really a new paradigm of composing, changing the idea of the composer from somebody who stood at the top of a process and dictated precisely how it was carried out, to somebody who stood at the bottom of a process, who carefully planted some rather well-selected seeds, hopefully, and watched them turn into something. Now, I was sort of looking for support for that idea. The term bottom-up hadn't come into existence then. Chaos theory, complexity theory, so on, they didn't exist. I don't even think we had catastrophe theory then. What we did have, though, was cybernetics. And I became very interested in the work of a cybernetician called Stafford Beer. In fact, I became friends with him ultimately. Stafford had written a book called The Brain of the Firm, The Managerial Cybernetics of Organization, which came out, I think, in 72 or 73. And it was a very exciting book because it was essentially about this idea, again, unspoken at the time, of bottom-up organization, of things growing from the bottom and turning into things of greater complexity. Now, you must understand why this was surprising at the time. It's surprising for the same reason that evolution theory is still surprising to most Americans, which is that the concept of something intelligent coming from something simple is very hard to understand. It's not intuitive at all. The whole shock about Darwinian evolution is that simplicity turns into complexity. It's not obvious that should happen. What happened in Stafford's work was that he was talking about organization and how things organize themselves in this new way. And there was one sentence in the book which I think I can still remember. He said, instead of trying to organize it in full detail, you organize it only somewhat, and you then rely on the dynamics of the system to take you in the direction you want to go. And this became my sort of motto for how I wanted composition to be. As I said, I started a correspondence with Stafford, and we did some presentations about this idea, both in music and science, in Canada. Round about the end of the 70s, I started to become aware of another field of activity, which at that time was represented by just one single example in my experience. And this was the cellular automata game called Life by the mathematician John Conway. I won't go into that now because I don't have time, but to give you a very simple glimpse of what that was about, I think to science it was sort of had the kind of impact that Duchamp's Urino had in art. It's sort of such a simple idea which was so glowingly far-reaching that you thought, my God, everything's different now. Life is a very simple mathematical game which is entirely deterministic, which is to say that you know exactly what all the inputs to the system are, you know exactly what rules govern it, they're very simple rules, and yet the outcomes are extremely unintuitive. They're very unpredictable, sometimes extremely boring, sometimes incredibly elaborate and beautiful. But more than anything else, they're not predictable. So your intuition kind of runs out on you there. And shortly after that, various other versions of cellular automata started to make themselves known to me. I don't really know the history of them chronologically, but I became aware of two-dimensional cellular automata. Stephen Wolfram and people like that were starting to work with. And I started to realize that in science too, there was this feeling that we had to start thinking about organization in a different way. We had to start thinking about how things came into being with a different set of paradigms. And I would try to explain this to people. Here, this is where I make a connection to the subject that we're talking about today. I would try to explain this to people in terms of talking about the difference between an architect and a gardener. An architect, at least in the traditional sense, is somebody who has an in-detail concept of the final result in their head, and their task is to control the rest of nature sufficiently to get that built. Nature being things like bricks and sites and builders and so on. Everything outside has to be subject to an effort of control. A gardener doesn't really work like that, unless it's, as Marcus mentioned, Versailles, which is, to me, the most grotesque of all gardens, since it's the total denial of nature and the complete expression of human control over nature. So it's perfect forerunner to the industrial age, Versailles. But what I think about, I suppose my feeling about gardening, and I suppose most people's feeling about gardening now, is that what one is doing is working in collaboration with the complex and unpredictable processes of nature and trying to insert into that some inputs that will take advantage of those processes and, as Stafford Beer said, take you in the direction that you wanted to go. Use the dynamics of the system to take you in the direction you wanted to go. So I don't know how much time I've got. Am I okay? Yeah, okay. So my feeling has been that the whole concept of how things are created and organized has been shifting for the last 40 or 50 years. And as I said, this sequence of sciences, cybernetics, catastrophe theory, chaos theory, complexity theory, are really all ways of us trying to get used to this idea that we have to stop thinking of top-down control as being the only way in which things can be made. We have to actually lose the idea of intelligent design, because that's actually what that is. The top-down theory is the same as intelligent design. And we have to actually stop thinking like that and start understanding that complexity can arise in another way, and variety and intelligence and so on. So my own response to this has been, as an artist, has been to start to think of my work too as a form of gardening. So about 20 years ago, I came up with this idea, this term, generative music, which is a general term I use to cover not only the stuff that I do, but the kind of stuff that Reich is doing and Terry Riley and lots of other composers have been doing. And essentially the idea there is that one is making a kind of music in the way that one might make a garden. One is carefully constructing seeds or finding seeds, carefully planting them, and then letting them have their life. So, and that life isn't necessarily exactly what you'd envisage for them. It's characteristic of the kind of work that I do that I'm really not aware of how the final result is going to look or sound. So, in fact, I'm deliberately constructing systems that will put me in the same position as any other member of the audience. I want to be surprised by it as well, and indeed I often am. What this means really is a rethinking of one's own position as a creator. You stop thinking of yourself as me, the controller, you, the audience, and you start thinking of all of us as the audience, all of us as people enjoying the garden together. Gardner included. So there's something in the notes to this thing that says something about the difference between order and disorder. It's in the preface to the little catalogue we have, which I take issue with, actually, because I think it isn't the difference between order and disorder. It's the difference between one understanding of order and how it comes into being and a newer understanding of how order comes into being. And another way I can translate that is to say it's a repositioning of ourselves on the control-surrender spectrum. I'll talk briefly about that, then I'll shut up. We're used to the idea, coming from the industrial and very intelligent post-Enlightenment history that we have, we're used to the idea that the great triumph of humans is their ability to control. And indeed, that must be the case to some extent. What we're not so used to is the idea that another great gift we have is the talent to surrender and to cooperate. Cooperation and surrender are actually parts of the same skill. To be able to surrender is to be able to know when to stop trying to control and to know when to go with things, to be taken along by them. And that's a skill that we actually have to start relearning. Our hubris about our success in terms of being controllers has made us overlook that side of our abilities. So we're so used to dignifying controllers that we forget to dignify surrenderers. The reason I have an a cappella group of the kind that John mentioned is because it gives me every Tuesday evening the chance to do some surrendering, which is, by the way, the reason people go to church, I think, as well, and to art galleries. What you want from those experiences is to be reminded of what it's like to be taken along by something, to be taken, to be lifted up, to be whatever the other words for transcendence are. And I think we find those experiences in at least 4 areas: religion, sex, art, and there's probably another one that I've forgotten now. What? Drugs, that's right, that's the other one. Yeah, thank you. That's right. So I tend to put those all under the umbrella of surrender, and in fact, it's interesting that if you look at the various cultures of the world, those things are either totally dignified or totally taboo in different mixtures, in different cultures. In some cultures, some of them are mixed together, like Hindu culture mixes sex and religion. Some cultures mix drugs and religion. I don't know of any culture that mixes all of them, but if any of you do, please tell me about it. But essentially, they're all experiments with ourselves in trying to remind ourselves that the controlling talent that we have must be balanced by the surrendering talent that we also have. And so my feeling, my idea about art as gardening is to sort of revivify that discussion and to say, let's accept the role of gardener as being equal in dignity to the role of architect, as in fact is shown in this lovely pavilion here. Thank you. That's all I want to say.
Hans Ulrich is going to join us for the discussion. One interesting note, in 1965, Jonas Mekas, who's here, hired me to run the Filmmakers Cinematheque, which the mandate of which was to create the expanded cinema festival. He gave me a list of 50 artists. One of the artists was Terry Riley. Terry and Ken Dewey were running something called Theater X. Dewey was a theatrical guy, and they did an insanely compelling performance that changed everything for me. At the same time, Cage had given me a copy of Cybernetics, and then I was invited by Wiener's heirs to bring a group of these artists to MIT and Harvard to meet with Walter Rosenberg, Harold Edgerton, and all the people that Weiner worked with. The meeting was a disaster. Okay.
Thank you so much to all the speakers. Thank you so much to Brian, to Jennifer, to Mark, and of course to John. And John suggested that we follow this by a discussion. And John, do you want to start with questions?
Well, I just started. So, well, for Jennifer, what about normative aspects of your totem people? You're talking about societal norms of a tribe in the Northwest. Richard Dawkins was just banned from speaking at a middle-class country club in America. If they had, it seems like all your totem subjects are wouldn't pertain to the kinds of values that the people that go to that country club might have. So where's the science?
Yeah.
Why is this science? Is this politics?
Well, I think your point is you're asking, or perhaps the statement is simply that shame is dynamic and it differs across cultures, across subcultures, according to the social norm. So something that is shameful in a tribe in the Amazon, for instance, eating in public alone, is very shameful with the Bakari tribe. That is obviously not the case here. So that's why shame is so fascinating and dynamic, is that it is always calibrated. And when people think, oh, somebody is acting shamelessly, or somebody is acting with a lot of shame, it's because they're considering the social norm involved. And that's what makes it so that a middle-class country club or whatever in the US doesn't want Dawkins around and other people herald him. It's a different social norm. The science is simply, and I think what you're getting at with the totem, and this is perhaps an issue that we should disclose, we had 500 Americans, they're all on the internet. It's a different subculture in America than, let's say, my parents and their friends in Ohio. They're on Amazon Turk. So their votes for the worst corporations could in fact be different than other people. We're trying to get around that by sample size. Mm-hmm. But I think that's something that we have to consider, that the subsample on Amazon Mechanical Turk could be quite different actually than the broader American voice.
What was the plan to project this on what building?
Yeah, you wanted to project it, so because that's actually a very interesting question.
Wait till you project it and see what happens.
See what happens? Well, I'm waiting for a lawsuit.
No, forgetting about that, John Haight's new book on the righteous mind talks about the 5 value systems that inform people that have conservative way of looking at things versus the 2, which are fairness and harm, that most liberal type people have. These may all be good people, they just have a very different way of looking at the world. So we're having these protests now in New York, spreading all over America. They seem heroic to people like me. Other people see these as leading to the end of the world. And so, and the same people that support Tea Party doing it are calling this crowd criminals. That's all I'm talking about.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting question around that is sort of what are the most basic social norms in society? And we see that even primates exhibit issues of fairness and responses to fairness. Things around, I suspect things around hygiene are early social norms, but then they become more complex and patterned depending on the society.
Don't you think, hello, we've corresponded before about the idea of shame, but also about the idea of honor, which I think is the counterpart to it. And I've often been impressed, having been in the 60s and 70s somewhat involved in the commune movement in England, that almost any political system works at a small enough scale. So I've been to communist communes, anarchist communes, anarcho-syndicalist communes, free love communes, all sorts of things. And in fact, they all work pretty well if there aren't more than about 100 people. So the constraints, the social constraints of honor and shame seem to be the things that are actually operating then. Whatever the formal rules are, you know, we share everything, or we only share things that we earn, or blah, blah, blah. Whatever the formal set of rules are seems to be irrelevant compared to the strength of the honor and shame structure of the society, which, of course, doesn't work over a certain number of people. Over about 150 people, you can't have the kind of personal acquaintanceships that would make shame and honor effective for you. So you have to invent sort of larger scale versions of honor and shame, which I suppose is what your totems are intended to do.
Oh, I think, and on top of that, as group size grows, you have, again, more diversity of what the norm is considered to be. Honor, I think, it's an interesting question, because if you said, and there are things out there right now to shame people who aren't paying their taxes, for instance. Imagine the antithesis to that. You honor people who pay their taxes? That's absurd. That's the norm, right? You don't honor those people. That's how things are done. So when people propose, well, we want a more positive society, then we come up against those types of questions that are essentially, what about when there is no honor version of the problem involved?
Brian's question about the larger issue is also actually, was interesting. Yesterday there were like lots of projects about smaller gardens, and then at the same time we had West 8 presenting a garden in China with 10,000 bridges. And I was wondering, listening to your wonderful speeches, if maybe you have your own garden projects, because I mean obviously we're here on the grounds of the Serpentine, where Ian Hamilton Finlay did this wonderful stone circle, and Ian Hamilton Finlay built in Scotland a very amazing garden called Little Sparta, where he spent most of his time. And I know, for example, Brian, that you have worked in gardens. I mean, you once told me about this project in China, where sound entered the garden. So I was wondering if maybe you can tell us about this, and if you have your own garden project. And then I was wondering, when I listened to Jennifer, if you have the idea of maybe a new topic, totem garden, a very big totem garden. I was wondering if Mark has any city gardens which are unrealized.
I planted, a couple of years ago, I planted 6,000 trees in my garden, which, as you can gather, is a fairly big garden. And I have done a few musical projects in gardens, though I've had mixed feelings about them, because there's always a difficulty with music in cities, that you tend to want to make them louder than the surrounding, but that's exactly not the point. You don't want to defeat the surrounding by having very loud music. It's unbearable. So I don't tend to do that many city projects now. I've just been asked to do a project in a garden in Rio. In Rio. That's a botanical gardens on the outskirts of Rio, so I may do that. But I have mixed feelings about public art, actually. In general, I think the assumption that it's always a good idea is not such a good assumption.
Well, I'm going to disappoint you in that I don't have any garden projects in a literal sense, and I must tell you that I'm probably one of the worst gardeners there is. All I do with my garden is to stave off the wildness. I just rip things out, and there's a sort of natural selective process that goes on in my garden, which is that things that can survive my torture of them, ripping things out, are the ones that remain year after year after year. And so I have a hardier and hardier garden as time goes on. But I think more seriously, what I want to do is pick up a little bit on what Brian was talking about sort of gardening as a metaphor for how we generate ideas in art or in music or in science, because there may be a misunderstanding among many people in this audience in thinking that scientists are people who impose a sort of top-down order on the world, when in fact, when you talk to scientists about the creative aspects of their work, what you find is that most scientists really have very little idea about where their work is going. And the best science is probably the most like gardening, in that what one does is approaches a set of phenomena with a set of tools, and these might be Brian's seeds, scatter them around a little bit, and then let nature tell you a little bit about the way that it really is. And so I suppose as a scientist, I view what I do as a process of sitting back and letting nature tell me about what it's like, but through the lens of some of the tools that I can bring to it. And so if I'm a gardener, if I can somehow aspire to that accolade, it's really just in taking a very hands-off and bottom-up view of my explorations of the world. And this work I described to you about the way cities are understood now is really a wonderful example of that, because no one designs cities. No one's ever designed a city that anyone liked. And we, in this country, have a few designed cities, and they're the butt of our jokes, aren't they? And the best cities around the world have all evolved organically from a process of following what scientists, complexity scientists, call local rules. A very small number of local rules can generate these wonderfully complex objects like cities that are tremendously efficient. Let me give you an example. I traveled in from Oxford yesterday, and to do that I had to leave my house and make my way to the station where somebody had got up in the morning ready to sell me a ticket. I bought that ticket, and then I went through a turnstile where somebody was waiting to let me through that turnstile. They'd got up in the morning waiting to let me through that turnstile. And then a man came in driving the train, and he had got up in the morning getting ready to take me into London. And you can see where this journey's going. Everywhere I went, somebody had got up that morning readying themselves for me to show up so they could let me through somewhere, check me into a hotel, cook my breakfast this morning, and so on. But the truth we all know is that absolutely nobody got up yesterday thinking they were going to do a single thing for me. Everybody was following their local rules, which was somebody works at the station, somebody works at the taxi company, somebody works at the hotel, and that's all emerged very organically from the ground up. And understanding those local rules and how they give rise to this beautiful complexity around us is a lot like gardening.
Geoffrey West, who has studied urban nature, also brings in ideas of the biological end of corporations. Are you familiar with that?
Yes. I mean, what John's referring to is that complexity theorists who've studied corporations try to understand why it is that corporations have seemingly a finite life. Most corporations die, whereas if you wait long enough, whereas most cities endure. And Geoffrey likes to draw our attention to the fact that you can even bomb and sack and burn down cities, and yet they somehow survive. And this really comes back in many ways to these ideas of generativeness and gardening, in that, as I said to you when I was talking about cities, they've been this magnet throughout our history for creative and innovative people. And you may think that's a sort of cliche, but in fact it's not. If you want to get something done, you don't go out into the countryside, do you? You go into a city. And Geoffrey's drawn attention to the fact that cities seem to have a sort of infinite lifespan. Of course, it isn't infinite, but it's longer than our attention span, partly because they have this ability to regenerate themselves by following local rules. And whereas corporations seem to have a generative phase early in their growth, and then everyone starts following a very fixed set of rules, making the same product, and they don't reset their carrying capacity in the way that cities do. They don't grow organically.
Are you a garden?
Am I a gardener?
A garden.
A garden. Well, I was thinking when I...
Like, well, how do you talk about nature, then you talk about yourself as though you're outside of nature. You know, the people tending the gardens, but isn't it all a garden?
I was wondering whether it would be a productive thing to think about one's work as a kind of crop. If you could think, what am I going to plant this year, and how's it looking, how's it going to come up? And whether you could sort of have a different long-term view of your work as an artist if you start to think of it not as a gardener but as a farmer. And then I thought, oh, isn't that what most art galleries actually do? You know, they're sort of farming, they're creating monocultures really out of their artists, I think, in general. Because it seems to me in fine arts in particular, it's a very good idea to have one good idea and never have another one.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that idea, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much, John, Brian, Jennifer, Mark. Thank you very much.